The siren was still ringing in my ears when I heard him say it. I was on the gurney, half conscious, the fluorescent lights of the emergency bay sliding past like a film strip, when a voice I recognized, a voice I'd known for 6 years, a voice that used to call me sweetheart at Thanksgiving, cut through the chaos with a coldness that woke me up faster than any smelling salt could have. Don't waste resources on her. She's not really family. I didn't see his face. I was staring at the ceiling tiles, one arm strapped down, and 4-line burning cold in the back of my hand, my ribs screaming with every breath. But I knew that voice. Richard Cross. My father-in-law. Standing somewhere just outside my line of sight, talking to a nurse like I was a stray dog someone had hit on the highway. 6 years I had worn his son's last name. 11 years I had worn my country's uniform. And in that moment, flat on my back in a hospital in Millbrook, Georgia, none of it seemed to matter to him at all. I heard footsteps stop. A pause that felt longer than it was. Then a woman's voice, quiet, careful, but unmistakably firm. Sir, do you understand her rank? I didn't know it yet, lying there with my vision blurring in and out, but that single sentence, spoken by a nurse I hadn't even met, was the first thread in a story that was about to unravel everything Richard Cross had spent years building. My name is Elena Cross. Captain, United States Army, currently assigned to the Judge Advocate General's Corps out of Fort Ashford, North Carolina. 11 years of service, 3 deployments behind me, and a law degree I'd earned nights and weekends while other people were sleeping. Please subscribe my channel for new videos. Also write in comment from where are you watching. I married Daniel Cross when I was 26. He was Army 2, Signal Corps, the kind of quiet, steady man who fixed things instead of talking about them. We built a life in the gaps between deployments, a small house near base, a dog named Cooper, a habit of leaving sticky notes on the bathroom mirror for each other before early departures. It wasn't glamorous. It was ours. Daniel's family never fully warmed to me. His father, Richard, ran a construction and property business 2 hours away in Millbrook, the kind of small-town operation where he was used to being the biggest name in the room. He had opinions about everything, my career, my rank, the fact that I sometimes outranked his son, the fact that I kept my own bank account. His wife, Diane, was softer, quieter, the sort of woman who smoothed over tension with second helpings of casserole and never quite said what she thought. Daniel's younger sister, Karen, lived closer to their parents and had, over the years, absorbed more of her father's version of events than her own observations. 3 weeks before the accident, Daniel had deployed on a 6-month rotation overseas, no notice beyond the usual, no drama, just a hard goodbye at 4 a.m. and a promise to call when he could. Keep an eye on my dad for me, he'd said at the door, only half joking. You know how he gets when I'm not around to run interference. I laughed it off. I didn't know yet how right he was. The morning of the accident, I was driving back from a legal aid clinic I ran once a month for junior enlisted soldiers, helping with power of attorney paperwork, wills, the unglamorous administrative backbone of military life that nobody thinks about until they need it. Rain had started an hour earlier, that thin grey Carolina rain that turns roads into glass. A truck ran a red light doing 40 in a 25. I remember the color of it, faded blue, and then I remember white, and then I remember waking up in the back of an ambulance with a paramedic's face hovering over mine, asking me to tell her my name. Captain, I managed. Elena Cross. She didn't know yet what that would come to mean in the next hour. By the time I reached Millbrook Regional Medical Center, my phone, shattered somewhere on the highway, had already done what phones do in emergencies, alerted my emergency contact. Daniel, overseas, unreachable for the next several hours by anything but relayed message. Which meant the first person to physically walk into that hospital and identify himself as my family was Richard Cross. I was already back to the moment where the story had started, strapped to a gurney, drifting in and out, listening to my father-in-law tell a stranger in scrubs that I wasn't worth the trouble. The nurse who spoke up was named Grace Iborra. I wouldn't learn her name until later, but I would never forget her voice, steady, unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned a long time ago not to be rattled by loud men in waiting rooms. Sir, I need you to lower your voice, she told him, according to what she'd tell me weeks afterward. This patient is a United States Army officer. We treat her the same as anyone who comes through those doors, regardless of what her paperwork says about you. Richard, by all accounts, didn't back down easily. He told Grace he was there to handle things since his son wasn't available, that he had power of attorney over the family's affairs, and that decisions about my care and my belongings should go through him. He said it with the practiced confidence of a man used to being obeyed. What none of us knew yet, not Grace, not the attending physician, not even me, drifting somewhere between consciousness and static, was that Richard wasn't simply overstepping out of grief or worry. He was executing a plan. I woke up fully some 6 hours later in a hospital room with cracked ribs, a concussion, and a hairline fracture in my wrist. Diane was in the chair by the window, twisting a tissue in her hands. Richard stood near the door, arms crossed, the posture of a man supervising a job site rather than visiting his daughter-in-law in the ICU. "You gave everyone a scare," Diane said softly, the first thing anyone said to me. "Where's Daniel?" My voice came out as a rasp. "Trying to get emergency leave," Richard said, before Diane could answer. "Not that it's easy, given how the army handles that sort of thing." He said the army the way some people say a rival company's name. I should have known then that something was off. But concussions make you slow, make you trust the wrong things. It wasn't until the next morning, when I asked the hospital's patient advocate for a copy of my admission paperwork, that the first crack showed. "I'm sorry, the advocate said, frowning at her screen. "There's a notation here that your father-in-law submitted a power of attorney document authorizing him to make medical and financial decisions on your behalf during incapacitation. It was filed with our records office yesterday afternoon." I stared at her. "I never signed anything like that." "It has a signature," she said carefully, turning the screen toward me. It was my name. My handwriting, or something close enough to fool a records clerk in a busy hospital. But I hadn't signed it. I'd never even seen the document before. Something cold moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the fractured ribs. I spent the next 2 days in that hospital bed doing the thing I'd been trained to do for 11 years. I stopped reacting and started building a case. The first call I made, once my hands could hold a phone steady, was to Major Renata Kessler, a JAG colleague of mine at Fort Ashford who specialized in family and estate law issues for deployed service members. She taught me half of what I knew about the Service Members Civil Relief Act. "Send me a photo of the document," she said, her voice crisp even through a bad connection. "Don't sign anything else. Don't discuss finances with him. And Elena, don't confront him yet. Not until we know how deep this goes." "How deep can it go? He's my husband's father, not a criminal mastermind." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause Kessler used when she already suspected something I didn't want to hear. "People don't forge a power of attorney on a whim," she said. "They do it because there's something specific they need access to. Find out what that something is." It didn't take long. Diane, of all people, gave me the first real thread, not on purpose, but the way people who've been quiet too long sometimes let things slip when they think they're being kind. She came to visit alone on my 3rd day in the hospital, bringing a casserole dish nobody there could eat, and sat by my bed twisting her hands the way she always did. "Richard's been under a lot of stress," she said, apropos of nothing. "The business account transfers, getting everything moved before the audit." She stopped herself. "What audit?" I asked. Diane's face went the color of the hospital walls. "Nothing." I misspoke. But it wasn't nothing. Kessler, working from the outside with a paralegal friend who owed her a favor, found the first real answer within 48 hours. Richard Cross's construction business was under a preliminary state audit for irregular fund transfers, and 3 weeks before my accident, a joint account that Daniel and I shared, one that held a modest inheritance from my grandmother along with our combined deployment savings, had received a consolidation transfer, moving nearly all of it into a business account controlled by Richard. The account was in my name. The transfer required my signature. I had never signed it. I want to tell you I confronted him immediately, dramatically, the way it happens in movies. I didn't. I was a JAG officer before I was anything else in that hospital room, and JAG officers know that the person who reacts first usually loses the case. So instead, I did what Kessler told me to do. I smiled at Richard the next time he visited. I let him believe I hadn't found anything. I asked innocuous questions about helping him manage things while Daniel was gone, and I watched him relax into the story he'd built for himself, the responsible patriarch, stepping in during a crisis, doing what needed to be done. Meanwhile, Kessler was quietly pulling threads. The second reveal came from an unlikely source, Karen, my sister-in-law, who I'd always assumed had simply never liked me much. She showed up at the hospital on day 5, stiff and awkward, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers like a peace offering she wasn't sure she wanted to give. "I need to say something," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Dad told the whole family, actually, that you'd been pressuring Daniel for money before he deployed. That you two were fighting about finances, and that's part of why the accident happened, because you were distracted and upset." I felt something in my chest go very still. That's not true. Daniel and I weren't fighting about anything. "I know that now," Karen said quietly. "Because Daniel called me last night. Finally got a connection through. He didn't know any of this was happening, the power of attorney, the account, none of it. He was furious. He said Dad's been telling people a story that isn't true to explain why he needed to step in." There it was, the third layer. Richard hadn't just moved money and forged a document. He'd built a narrative in advance, seeding it through the family, so that when questions eventually came, there would already be a story in place. The struggling young couple, the overwhelmed daughter-in-law, the responsible father stepping in to save everyone from a mess of my making. He had turned my own accident into evidence against me before I'd even opened my eyes in that hospital bed. I lay there that night, wrist aching, staring at the ceiling, and understood something with total clarity. This wasn't about grief, or overreach, or an old man being controlling in a crisis. This was calculated. And calculated men rarely stop at one betrayal. The fourth reveal took longer, and it was the one that scared me most, because it wasn't about money at all. Kessler called me on day 7, her voice unusually careful. "Elena, I need you to sit down for this. I'm literally in a hospital bed. I'm sitting. There's a second document in the county records office. Filed the same day as the power of attorney." A pause. "It's a petition. For annulment of your marriage to Daniel Cross. On the grounds of fraud." The room went very quiet. "On what possible grounds," I said slowly, "would he claim fraud?" "The petition alleges," Kessler said, and I could hear her choosing each word like she was diffusing something, "that you married Daniel under false pretenses connected to his military benefits and family estate, essentially, that the marriage wasn't entered into in good faith." I had given 11 years to the army. I had built a career reading exactly this kind of document, exactly this kind of legal maneuver, for other people's families. And now one was sitting in a county filing office with my name on it, filed by a man who had known me for 6 years and had eaten dinner at my table more times than I could count. If that petition succeeded, if he could get it filed and processed while I was incapacitated, while Daniel was overseas and unreachable, it wouldn't just be humiliating. It would strip away my legal standing as next of kin, my medical decision authority, my spousal benefits, my claim to that inheritance money, every institutional protection that came with being Daniel Cross's wife. It was, I realized, the reason for the fake power of attorney in the first place. Richard hadn't needed medical authority over me because he cared what happened to my body. He'd needed it because it gave him standing to act as though our marriage and my place in this family was already something he controlled. "He's not trying to help manage a crisis," I said quietly, mostly to myself. "He's trying to erase me from it." Kessler didn't disagree. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over you when you stop being afraid and start being methodical. I'd felt it before, in deployment briefings, in courtrooms, in the moments right before you present a case you know you can win. I felt it now, lying in a hospital bed with a fractured wrist, and it felt, oddly, like coming home to myself. "I need everything," I told Kessler. "The forged POA, the transfer records, the annulment petition, and anything you can find connecting the timing of the audit to the timing of the transfer. If he's moving money to protect it from an audit, there's a paper trail. Men like Richard always think they're smarter than the paperwork. And the annulment petition? That one, I said, I want to handle myself. In person. With Daniel there, if we can get him home. Getting Daniel home took 4 more days, an emergency leave request, and a letter from Kessler's office citing both my medical status and the fraudulent legal action being taken against a deployed service member's family, the kind of language that moves paperwork faster than almost anything else in the military bureaucracy. I spent those 4 days doing something I hadn't expected to be doing from a hospital bed, quietly building a case file, one document at a time, with Grace Iborra, the nurse who'd first stood up to Richard, unknowingly becoming one of my most important witnesses. Grace had been on shift the day Richard arrived, and she was on shift again the day I was discharged with instructions for follow-up care. Somewhere in between, she'd become something like a friend, the kind you make in bad circumstances, bonded by having witnessed each other at your most exposed. He came back twice more while you were still under observation, she told me one evening, folding a blanket at the foot of my bed with the efficient calm of someone who'd done 10,000 small kindnesses in her career. Tried to get your chart. Tried to get discharge authority. I logged every request. Hospital policy, anything that unusual gets documented. Why? I asked her. Why push back on him at all? You didn't know me. Grace considered the question like it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. Because I've worked in this hospital 11 years, and I've seen exactly what he was doing before. Family members who show up loud and confident, using tone instead of paperwork to get what they want. Rank doesn't come with a badge you can see on a woman in a hospital gown, Captain. But something in the way he talked about you, dismissing you before you'd even opened your eyes, that told me everything I needed to know about who was telling the truth in that room. It was the kind of statement that didn't need embellishing. I filed it away, along with everything else, and waited for Daniel to come home. Daniel landed at Fort Ashford 9 days after my accident, 22 hours of travel etched into his face, and drove straight to Millbrook without stopping. I met him at the door of the small rental house we'd moved into after the hospital discharged me, my wrist in a cast, my ribs still tender enough that his hug had to be careful. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. Don't skip anything to protect me. I didn't. I laid it all out on our kitchen table, the forged power of attorney, the moved money, the audit, the rumors seeded through the family, the annulment petition sitting quietly in a county office waiting for a hearing date. Daniel sat very still through most of it, the particular stillness of a man doing everything he could not to put his fist through a wall. He filed to annul our marriage, Daniel said finally, like the words tasted wrong in his mouth. While I was overseas. While you were in a hospital bed. He needed legal standing, I said. Fraud on his part looks a lot less like fraud if there's an annulment already in motion suggesting the marriage itself wasn't legitimate. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the thing I'd been waiting for someone in his family to say since the moment I woke up in that hospital. My father's wrong. About all of it. And he's going to have to say so somewhere it counts. We requested a family mediation hearing, the kind attorneys use to resolve estate and financial disputes before they escalate into full litigation, and Kessler, along with a civilian attorney she recommended, filed the necessary motions. Richard, confident as ever, agreed to attend. I don't think, even then, he believed we had anything real. I think he believed his version of the story, responsible father, troubled young couple, overreacting daughter-in-law, was simply the version that would win, the way it always had in his world. He was wrong about that too. The hearing took place 3 weeks later in a conference room at the county courthouse, fluorescent lit, a long table, a court reporter typing quietly at one end. Richard arrived in a pressed shirt, Diane beside him looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, Karen sitting a few chairs down, arms crossed, clearly uncertain which version of her family she was there to defend. Richard's attorney opened with the story we expected: financial concerns about a young couple's stability, a father stepping in during a genuine crisis, a power of attorney executed with good intentions that had simply not been properly witnessed. Then Kessler stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She placed 3 documents on the table, one at a time, the way you'd lay down cards in a game you already knew you'd won. This is the power of attorney filed the day of Captain Cross's accident, she said, sliding it toward the center of the table. The signature has been analyzed by a certified forensic document examiner. It does not match Captain Cross's known signature on file with the United States Army, a signature verified, notably, by a federal agency, which makes forging it not simply a civil matter, but a federal one. Richard's expression didn't change, but his hand, resting on the table, went very still. This, Kessler continued, laying down the second document, is the transfer record moving $118,000 from a joint account belonging to Captain Cross and Sergeant First Class Daniel Cross into an account controlled by Cross Construction and Development 3 weeks before a state audit was formally opened into that company's finances. The timing, she added, almost gently, is difficult to characterize as coincidence. Diane made a small sound beside her husband. I watched her hands twist together in her lap. And this, Kessler said, laying down the third document, is a petition for annulment, filed on the same day as the fraudulent power of attorney, alleging that Captain Cross entered her marriage in bad faith. Filed while she was unconscious in an intensive care unit. Filed by a man who is not a party to that marriage. The room was very quiet. It was Diane who broke first, not Richard. She put a hand over her mouth, and when she spoke, her voice cracked in a way that told me, finally, that some of what I'd assumed about her complicity had never been the full story. I didn't know about the annulment petition, she said. Richard, you told me it was just the power of attorney. You told me it was just to help with the accounts while Elena was recovering. Richard's jaw tightened. Diane. You told me it was to protect the family, she said, and something in her voice was breaking open, years of deferring to him cracking under the weight of what was on that table. Not to erase her. Not to take money that was never yours. That was the moment I understood the twist Kessler had warned me might be coming, the thing that surfaces after the apparent climax, when you think the case is already won. Diane hadn't simply been a passive bystander shielding her husband. She had been managed, the same way I had, the same way the whole family had, fed a partial truth designed to keep her compliant while Richard executed something far larger than helping with the accounts. And then, almost as an afterthought, Kessler produced a fourth document, one I hadn't seen before that morning. There's one more thing, she said. During the course of this investigation, we discovered that the account irregularities extend further back than Captain Cross's accident. 3 years ago, a trust established for Diane Cross by her late sister, intended for Diane's independent use, was quietly restructured under Richard Cross's signature authority. Diane, did you know that trust had been converted into a business asset? Diane's face went white. That was my sister's money, she whispered. For me. He told me it was invested. He told me it was growing. Richard said nothing at all. It was, I would think later, the moment his composure finally cracked, not because he'd been caught hurting me, someone he'd never much liked to begin with, but because the wife who had spent 30 years deferring to him was sitting in a courtroom hearing, for the first time, exactly how far his manipulation had actually gone. He hadn't just tried to erase his daughter-in-law from the family. He had been quietly, methodically doing something similar to his own wife for years, and none of us, including her, had known. The consequences, once the documents were on the table, moved with the particular efficiency of institutions that had simply been waiting for proof. The forged power of attorney and fraudulent transfer became part of the ongoing state fraud investigation into Cross Construction and Development. The annulment petition was withdrawn. Richard's own attorney advised him to drop it before it became one more count in a growing case rather than fight a claim that had no legal foundation. Restitution of the moved funds, both mine and Daniel's savings and Diane's trust, became a condition of the eventual settlement, alongside a formal admission of wrongdoing that spared the family a longer, uglier trial. Richard did not apologize. I want to be honest about that, because hope over shock value doesn't mean pretending every wrongdoer finds redemption. Some people simply face consequences and go on believing they were justified. Richard sold his stake in the company under legal pressure, paid restitution, and largely withdrew from the family that had once orbited around him. Daniel spoke to him twice in the following year. Both conversations were short. But Diane was different. Diane came to me 3 weeks after the hearing, in the kitchen of the house I shared with Daniel, and set down a small box on the table, my grandmother's ring, The one piece of that inheritance money's origin I hadn't even realized Richard had physically taken, tucked away in a safe deposit box under his name. I found it going through his things, she said quietly. I should have asked more questions years ago. About everything. I'm not asking you to forgive me all at once. I'm asking you to let me try to earn it. I let her. Trust doesn't rebuild in a single conversation, but it can start in one, and over the months that followed, Diane became, unexpectedly, one of the steadiest people in my corner, showing up to my follow-up appointments when Daniel's schedule didn't allow it, calling just to check in, slowly becoming the mother-in-law she might have been all along if she'd never been managed into silence. Karen apologized too, less dramatically, in the form of showing up more, asking more, assuming less. It wasn't a redemption arc so much as a correction, a woman who'd absorbed a false story finally choosing to look at the evidence instead. And Grace Ibarra, the nurse who'd asked one quiet, steady question in a hallway I never even saw, became, in the strangest way, family. I invited her to Daniel's homecoming dinner 6 months later. She came in street clothes instead of scrubs, looked around the table at Diane passing dishes and Karen laughing at something Daniel said, and told me, quietly, that she didn't often get to see how a story ended. Most of the time, she said, I just get the middle. The scared part. I'm glad I got to see this part too. 8 months after the accident, I stood at a promotion ceremony at Fort Ashford, my wrist fully healed, my ribs no longer aching in the cold, Daniel in the front row beside Diane and Karen, Grace a few seats down in her Sunday best. I was pinned as a major that afternoon, the culmination of 11 years of work that had nearly been erased on paper by a man who once looked at me on a gurney and decided I wasn't worth the trouble. He was wrong. He was wrong about my rank, wrong about my marriage, wrong about what family means, and wrong, most of all, about what happens when you underestimate a woman simply because she's lying down. I think about Grace's question a lot, the one that started it all, asked to a man who thought volume was the same as authority. Do you understand her rank? He didn't. But by the end, he understood it better than anyone. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like Elena's, stories about quiet strength finally being seen, hit subscribe. There's more waiting for you here.